Hi, welcome. All right, so today we're talking about rhythm for singers, which is a really great topic, as always. Rhythm for any musician, really. And this is a kind of an intro guide just to explain what it is and the framework, as always, but also a practical guide as well. So I want to make sure that it's hands on. And so this is one that I definitely recommend that you try things out with me. And we'll talk about some tricks, as always, about how to just sort of get into the concept of rhythm and like with most of the things I practice and teach, it's a natural experience. It's something that we can tap into and then become more and more aware of and then kind of build from there. So that's going to be the strategy here. Um, you know, in general, when we're thinking about rhythm, I like to think of it in sort of three different aspects. There's the physical concept of it, like through motion. This is something that we all perceive pretty naturally, with dance and some other concepts. Hi, welcome. So we're going to talk about using our hands, snapping, tapping, things like that that help us really understand and physicalize rhythm and staying in time. It's good to mention that this is really, really essential when you're working with other musicians and you're trying to all coordinate, like a choir, a band, but it's also just helpful for yourself and for writing music and for learning things. Hi, welcome. That's awesome. It's so good to see you here. And this is going to be just a concept, or we're going to be talking about rhythm here today. So there'll be some singing involved, of course, because we want to talk about what's challenging with our voice singing in time. In general, it's like our voice can be kind of slow sometimes because if there's a physical coordination that's required. So we'll get into that. Hi, welcome. Good to see you. Um, so I was talking about there's a physical concept of rhythm. Our body, things in nature all function with rhythm, with synchronization of motion and groupings of patterns. And then the other thing to talk about is the visual component. This I'm not going to cover as much, but I'll mention this is specifically for like written music, for example. Like, what does it visually look like? We start to kind of internalize it that way. That's really helpful. And then the other thing is it becomes a mental thing. Once you start to understand the concepts of rhythm and meter and tempo, you can start to do all sorts of really interesting, weird things, sometimes that aren't as natural necessarily. So I treat this as a discovery. And in general, good rhythm has a lot to do with relationships between one thing, one event, a strike, right? A percussive instrument often, but it can be any musical thing. And the next thing that happens. So every beat, every sense of pulse is in relationship to other things. And that's what makes it really complicated, just like with pitch, right? With frequencies, they're all related and we have to organize them. So that's going to be the concept here with rhythm. The first thing is a rather kind of natural approach. Oh, that's really great. Yeah, absolutely. I always like to tell people writing music can also be a very natural experience. Start simple. Some of these tips are going to really help you. So with rhythm, it's just like with harmony, it's a fundamental aspect of music, our life in general. So one great thing that we can do to start practicing and understanding rhythm is actually through our speech. And I think this is a really fun one that you'll find a lot online, and it's using food words, but you could really use like any word at all, or a combination of words. And when we talk, there's a natural sort of rhythm to the way that we uh, emphasize things, and as well as just with exact syllables, kind of how long we do them when we talk. And this is going to make a lot of sense when I start saying it. It's kind of silly, actually. So you can actually look these up, and you can find like tons and tons of them. You can make them up, but it helps you get just an intuitive sense of rhythm, and we're talking specifically here about note values, how we can have different lengths of a note, meaning that one will be twice as long or half the length of another one. And so this is the concept. So we can use food words like I have a really basic one, hot dog, right? When we say the words hot dog, we don't go like hot dog, like really quickly, right? It's hot dog. There's two different things. Now I'm going to do another one, and you're going to see how this starts to make sense. Grape soda. Now, if I say soda, right, I'm not going grape soda. And if I did them all like that, um, I would sort of sound like a strange giant, perhaps. That acid reflex concept, we'll talk about that. Right now, it's not quite in my topic, but I have something on vocal health. And yes, you can sing with it, but you want to be careful and try to manage it because it can create some inflammation and that can make it really hard to sing. The more inflammation we have, the more likely we are to strain. So we always are trying to deal with getting rid of inflammation. So yes, you can sing with acid reflux, but you want to try and manage it because it can actually really harm your voice, especially if you're having a really bad flare. You're going to want to take it easy on your voice. Um, but yeah, that's for another topic, and we'll go over that. But I appreciate you asking because that's the whole point of these things is to have a kind of an open forum. But we'll do another thing on vocal health at some point, and I recommend that you look at some of our other content on that. Um, so let's keep going with this food concept. So it's just in our speech. It's just how we say certain words, and there's a pacing to it. We keep hot dog kind of as these separate things, and you're going to see how this builds into our concepts of rhythm and beats and note values. The other word that I was using is grape soda. Now you'll notice that grape has a length to it, but soda, it feels like each one of those is a little faster, right? And they almost fit into the same amount of time. Grape soda, right? It's not grape soda. Like I could do that, but my point is some of this is natural. The flip of that would be to say something like apple pie. Apple, right? That has two shorter things. Apple pie. Apple pie. Grape soda. Do you see how they're similar, but one of them has a longer note value, and then we have two shorter ones, and then that's grape soda, and then we have on the other side apple pie. So, anyways, you could just keep going with this, like hot fudge sundae. That one has it's kind of like they're each a little faster. Chicken nuggets. A lot of my younger students really like that one. Chicken nuggets because they all sound even, but they're faster. We don't go chicken nuggets, right? That's going to feel like these longer terms. So all I'm trying to say with this, and you don't have to overanalyze this. We have a natural intuitive sense of certain rhythms when we talk and when we speak, and there's a pacing to our speech. And this is sort of a natural way to start getting a sense of this. The other thing to do, and I'm actually going to use something that I never generally don't use, but this is just for visualization. It's this box that I have. It's not really a cajon, although it sort of kind of has some similar features. And it's just so I can show you some tapping. And I recommend that you also try this out on a hard surface. And we're going to start to try and tap out certain rhythms and see how some note values are longer than others and how they all kind of fit together. So this is the concept here. We have this beat called a quarter note. We'll talk about why it's called that, but it tends to be our common pulse. So I'm going to start to get a pulse here like this. And don't worry about it being perfectly in sync, but you're going to try to make it really even, right? We can do it with both hands, right? So we're getting a sense of a pulse. We'll talk about a metronome later. Now, let's say these are my quarter notes. Now I want to make one of my hands do two notes that fit into the same amount of time as one quarter note pulse. So it'll look like this. You see how there's two of these, and they're kind of evenly paced between this pulse. So this is kind of our fundamental concept in music is we have all these note values, and they're literally just like half or twice the speed or length, and they fit kind of inside of each other in this sort of matrix. You can look this up. When you look up note values, you can see a visual thing for this. Like whole notes have like a big circle. Half notes are like an open circle with a line. Quarter notes are like a closed circle with a line, and keeps going and going. And they're all kind of like fractions of each other. And from here, we can actually build up all sorts of complex rhythms because we're thinking of smaller units that fit inside of a larger unit. Don't overthink it, but try to really feel this out with me. It's if I'm doing quarter notes like this, and then I do eighth notes with one hand, quarter notes, they work together, right? I could do one where I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Right? I'm doing quarter notes, but now I'm doing 4 smaller beats that fit inside of that one. So this is something that you can start to practice yourself, is just trying to feel the relationship of beats. Like these two beats fit inside of the pulse of one of these. right? I can go the other direction. Let's say I have quarter notes and I want to make this hand do something that's twice as long and fits into two of these pulses. It's going to be like, right? It shows up later and I'm counting two of these pulses. So this is just kind of getting us into the sense of trying to physicalize rhythm. You can do it with snapping, right? People do this a lot of the time to get a sense of the pulse. My big point here is when we're, eventually we're going to get to talking about songs and sort of what I call like out in the wild, like interpreting a song and figuring out the pulse and how to follow along. It's helpful if you have sheet music and you know how to read music, because then it's all there for you as well. But that takes a little bit more time. So again, this concept is like we when we're working on our rhythm, we want to really try to feel it out first a little bit as you're getting used to it, before you start applying it to songs. We want a natural sense of rhythm and how we divide things up. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to follow along if you haven't actually worked on this skill separately. And if you're a drummer, this happens a lot. We work all the time on this skill of our ability to sort of divide up beats. We call it subdivisions. Sometimes that's a fancy word for this. So again, what I'm working on is my ability to think about how these beats are in relationship to each other. So for example, right, I had like hot dog, right? These are on these quarter notes. But if I go grape soda, right, it's kind of got its own unique rhythm to it. It's the own unique sort of beat pattern. Apple pie, apple pie. Now I'm trying to say these naturally, but also evenly enough so that I can start to see how this piece kind of fits in with rhythms. So you can actually use this to help guide you sometimes. And you can look up particular rhythms and see if there's a word that kind of helps you feel it out, which is actually just a great intuitive way to do this, especially for kids, but actually kind of proved for all ages. Hot fudge sundae, hot fudge sundae. See, that sort of has this chicken nuggets. They keep going and going. Anyways, this is this concept of note values. And it's really just about how we divide up our beats and how we think about them in relationship to each other, which can be a really hard thing to actually explain. That's why, again, it's really good to do this kind of physically. You can do snapping. I think it's nice to kind of do it like this because you can see the physical nature of it. Like when I'm trying to do faster ones, like I have to think consciously about moving my hands faster so that it fits into this new rhythm. And that takes a second physically even really accomplish. So this is this first concept of note values. And again, we can use sort of speech. Now I could turn this into a singing exercise. And again, this is where it's going to be helpful for us as singers. If you follow my content, you'll know that there's lots of simple exercises. Like, for example, like let's say we're just going ma, ma, ma. A lot of the time I do this outside of time with a loose sort of rhythm. And, it's ultimately not super tight, but I can practice this in rhythm and think about like a snap. And let's say I want to do one quarter note or one beat per note. So it'll be ma, 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 right? Ma, ma, ma. That way I'm practicing like that. I could do it so that it's two quarter notes or two beats or a half note as in a way that we would talk about this. Ma, ma, ma. So I'm waiting for two of those snaps before I move to the next thing. Ma, ma, ma. Do you notice that I land on a snap, right? I'm ma, ma, ma. There's this thing about time when you start to really think about it, where we get a little confused about, let's say I'm doing, and we're going to talk about meter in a second, but let's say I'm doing 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, where do I actually think about that starting and ending? Because it keeps going in a cycle. 1, 2, 3. So if I'm doing two beats, it goes all the way to 3, and then I start my next one. So it's like ma, ma, ma. It's how they string together. So we see this also with pitches. It can kind of really mess with people It's like the concept of fence posts, right? There's spaces in between the fence posts, and those are also important for us to keep track of. The fence posts being these snaps. So we can learn to kind of keep ourselves in time by feeling the pulse of something. And I recommend go check out some music and try to see if you can find and hook into the pulse. You could dance to it, right? Like this is something that we naturally experience. You might feel there's all sorts of pulses, but is there a through line? Is there something that kind of anchors all the relationships of the beats? That's going to be really, really essential, especially as a singer. We can get really, really lost sometimes. And one of my, I think it was like a choir teacher told me this, which is like just a fun thing to remember. But the right note in the wrong time, still the wrong note, right? And that's what's so hard about this is if we also, if we're in anticipation of trying to be in time, we often get out of sync with our breath. And this is why we sometimes tend to hold our breath, or we don't fill up with breath appropriately. Like if you're used to working with a conductor in choir, this happens all the time. People are getting ready to sing and then they go, and they try to breathe really quickly and their body's not ready to start singing. So often, let's say I'm going to come in on one and I'm hearing first 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'm supposed to come in on that one. I'm going to try to breathe way in advance. And so this is what I talk about. Like singing is not just the sound that's made, but it's how we generate the entire current. And so we actually have to time out our breath. And that's a really, really important thing, especially if you're somebody who plays multiple instruments. You're going to want to really consciously think about where you put your breath, because that's going to really change everything else that you do with your voice. And so if we're struggling with time, again, sometimes we get out of sync with our actual body. The other thing is if you're nervous, your heart rate can start to go out of sync with the music, and that can be really uncomfortable. But the cool thing is when you start to synchronize and really focus on the pulse and the beat of something, our body actually starts to synchronize with it as well. So there's a lot of cool magic to rhythm and percussion, listening to a drum beat. And it's something that can actually soothe you, but you just have to really consciously tune into the pulse and really try to feel it out. So what we're doing here as a practice is we are generating that pulse actually ourselves. We'll talk about using a metronome later, but I think it's really important actually for you to develop this internal sense of it and to practice doing that. And you might realize, I'm actually speeding up as I go, or I'm losing a sense of that pulse. And then we'll talk about the metronome later. But it's more about the relationships. So again, let's say someone's trying to conduct me, and we'll talk about conducting in a second, and I'm supposed to land right here. I'm going to go like this. So it's going to be like 1, 2. Right. And so my body was setting up like for a few beats. I was going, and then la, 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 whatever it is. I need to make sure that I'm ready to touch down and support and build up some pressure way in advance. Otherwise, you're going to get off your body. And this is what this actually singing in time and rhythm has a huge effect on our overall vocal technique and how comfortable our voice feels in general. So you can do this just singing on your own. It's great when you're doing it with groups. With a piano can be helpful as well. And certainly having a teacher can kind of guide you through this. So let's talk about some exercises, right? Like let's say, for example, I want to do, here's a great one. I'm going to do quarter notes. Up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to do them on my snaps. I'm going to go ma, 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 ma. Nice and easy. You can set your own tempo. We'll talk about tempo in a second. There's all these little parameters that we have to think about. Right now, we're just talking about note values. And so I've got these quarter notes. It's all relative, but I've decided these are quarter notes. Now I'm going to sing eighth notes on top of that quarter note pulse. And I'm going to go ma, 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 like that. Ma, 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 ma. Do you notice now, this is just for singing's sake. I'm not going ma, 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 because it's a lot of motion. So I'm actually grouping these together. You'll find that it's often visually shown this way. So it's ma, 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 in these groups of two to show that they are all connected to one beat. It's ma, 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 ma. And then you can take it to the next level. And you'll notice that other instrumentalists do this. It's kind of just par for the course as a musician, is to feel out the difference between these. So quarter notes, then eighth notes, and then I might try to fit in ma, 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 4 notes per snap. Those are going to be our 16th notes, or however we think about this. They are all divisions of each other. So there's 2 eighth notes and a quarter note. There's 4 16th notes in a quarter note. Or you could think of it as 2 16th notes and an eighth note. So it's like this fraction game that we're playing around with. Again, that's the mental component of it, and that sometimes can really throw people off. But really just pay attention to the physical aspect of it first if you're learning. And then later on, what I would say just for anyone who's a beat expert, what they'll tell you is that when we physicalize things, sometimes it can actually slow us down because there's limits to our physicality. So once we are able to do this mentally and really kind of keep an internal clock, that's when we can really be in perfect time. I think it's a combination of all of these forces, though, actually. It's great to physicalize it, especially at first. And then you learn to kind of turn it more into a conceptual thing, just like most things in our practice. So this is how the whole practice goes. Seems very simple, but it's just a great way to kind of keep yourself ordered with your time. When all of the times start to kind of merge into each other and you don't have a distinct difference between quarter note and, ma, ma, and ma, 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 they start to get really blurry, just like with pitches, right? And then we're just really lost, and we can, it's this never-ending kaleidoscopic thing that just keeps moving. And if you can't keep track of the groupings, you're going to be completely thrown off track. So again, we're talking about groupings, and we're going to get to meter in a second, which is that concept. But first, let's just play around with the note values. So quarter notes, we're going to go ma, 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 ma. Now, ma, 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 ma. Those are those eighth notes, exactly half, right? And then ma, ma, ma. Now the game is to do all of these with that consistent beat. So we're going to go ma, 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 ma. So that's going to be the game. You can see how you could extrapolate this into a number of things when you're practicing. I could do it the other way around. I could do twice as long. So I'm waiting for 2 snaps before I move. I'm going to switch the pattern because 5 is a lot. We tend to run out of breath. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, and it's going to be ma, 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 ma. Right? So we can do it that way. We can double up and and so we're singing 2 beats, right? And so I'm going for the length of 2 snaps, or I can make it so that it's exactly half of a beat and I'm doing 2 of them per beat, or exactly, et cetera, right? So this is this game, and we're just practicing dividing them up in a really sort of even way. And then this gets us to this next concept, which is, okay, we have all these divisions of beats and things. We need to keep track of them. And this is where we get to meter and measures. We start to group them together. And this is when, we talk about counting, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it comes back to 1 again. That's a particular kind of meter. And so this is just how we group things. And visually, you'll see this with sheet music. That's when we have a time signature with a little fraction thing like 4/4, 3/4, 2/4, et cetera, et cetera. It's right by our key signature, by our clef on the left-hand side. And that's, and it can change throughout the music, actually, just like with our key signatures and harmonies and things like that. So what that tells us, yes, I would, but this is right now we're just going to do it more on a physical side of things. But this, eventually can be a very visual practice. Perhaps in the future we'll do more of that. But I just want you to try to feel this out a little bit. So again, we're going to focus a little less on the visual aspect, but I'll talk about them. So there's three simple meters: 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4. And they're it seems like really complex, but I want you to feel it out. And I'm going to show you a little bit with conducting, actually, just sort of what it looks like. 2/4 just means that we have two beats per measure, and that the quarter note gets the beat. So it's sort of a relative thing, and it's really for sheet music. But the most important thing, if you're just doing this by ear, actually, is that is the top part of it. Just knowing that it's in groups of two. So a pattern like this is going to go like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. I kind of think of like pirate chanties, like da 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 dee da 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 da, kind of a thing. Um, then we have 3/4, which is uh, 3 beats per measure. So when we think of measures, what I'm talking about are these little cells. Again, we have a visual component, but there's actually just a physical component of this that we can practice. And you can actually start to see, like, oh, is this song in this pattern or is it in this pattern? We'll talk about what the most common one is, and it's actually called common time. But first, talking about 2/4, 3/4 in this nice logical way. So 3/4 is what we call our sort of waltz pattern generally. That's what a lot of us associate with. And we go like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So you can think of the dancing that happens like da, 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 da. That's the waltz pattern. The next one is 4/4, and this just means that we have 4 beats per measure. This is common time. Most music that you come across, especially in Western world of music, is going to be in common time. And so that's what I would check first, actually. With music, again, there's so many variations that play. So we want to talk about what's most common and common time. Sometimes it literally just has a C there, and that stands for 4/4. And this means we get 4 beats per measure. The quarter note gets the beat, and it's our classic 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Now, this is where it starts to get really interesting. So I'm just talking about finding our even pulse, but I'm talking about counting from 1 to 2 and repeating, or counting from 1 to 3 and repeating back to 1, or 1 to 4 and repeating back to 1. And what this does is it starts to change where we have emphasis. And this is going to be really, really helpful, especially for singers. Sometimes this is what we do with our body, is we actually, depending on how the music dictates, we can engage in certain places where we need emphasis, and we start to kind of sing into it a little more. The emphasis is the concept of is the stronger beat in these groupings. This is going to help you when you're starting to try to figure out with music what the pattern is. And again, it comes with experience. If you're getting really lost, you can have a teacher help you and guide you through it and really start to feel it out. But with this concept, so we've got 1, 2, 1. The 1 is actually generally the stronger beat for now. We'll talk about what you can do, all sorts of cool things, but again, what's most common. So it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Same thing. The 1 gets the strong beat, and then the 2 and the 3 are weaker. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Do you see how this is helping us anchor ourselves? So if we can keep track of groups of 3, and we can figure out where that 1 is every time, that main emphasized pulse, that's going to actually help us create a framework as we're singing, so that we know where things need to land. So this is the game. I know it's a little conceptual, but again, trying to get you to physicalize this as much as you can. So the last one was 4/4. This is where it gets kind of interesting. The typical 4/4 like square on the beat thing, which is actually not what we see all the time, especially contemporary music, tends to be something else. We'll mention in a second. We go 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's 2 strong pulses. It's on 1 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You might think that 1 is probably the strongest, but the 3 also has a strong feeling to it. Now, a lot of music that we see in contemporary music is actually what we call swung, or on the offbeat, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and we put the pulse on that offbeat, and it creates all these really cool things. Again, I try to steer people away, especially beginning singers, from starting with sheet music too early. Actually, I want you to physicalize things in your body, because contemporary music is actually not so bad to follow along by ear and sing along with. Often when we look at the rhythm of it, it can be really, really disorienting and kind of freak people out because it looks very complicated. Because again, music was written, or the theory of music was really put together back in an earlier time, and it really does make sense. But it's based off of kind of a pattern that was is more common, as this 1, 2, 3, 4. Now a lot of people, we really fear this 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it creates this kind of cool offbeat sensation. So you might notice that it's always a funny internal joke for a lot of singers and musicians when people tend to clap or snap on the 1 and the 3 compared to the 2 and the 4, when it's like a generally we tend to clap along on more contemporary songs, actually. And it's just funny because it's they're sort of getting the pulse a little backwards. So if you're like and you're like, oh, I'm clapping along, and people will get the mistake, and they'll go, and then it turns it into like a kind of a strange little march. My point again is that you can physicalize these things. They all kind of give us relationships in our body, and we start to move to it. It's a natural phenomenon. So I know I'm just exposing this to people, but ultimately you're going to get a more and more intuitive sense of this as you start to kind of piece these out, and you work on your rhythm with a flat surface, a drum, snapping. There's this classic thing that people, a lot of singers will do. Well, they'll go like ta ta ti 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 ta ta taka tiki taka tiki taka tiki ta, and you'll hear this actually also in like Indian classical music. It's a way to sort of verbalize with syllables these rhythms as well, and you can see it's drawing off of that natural concept. So if I'm like ta 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 ti 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 ta, that kind of thing. Taka tiki ta. So taka tiki taka is 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. Taka tiki ta. So these are ways that people will start to really internalize it. Also comes again from our natural speech and the flow of words, and rhythm is something that's sort of built into us. So there's a couple parameters. We're thinking about note values and relationships. It's a great way to jump into rhythm. Then we're talking about meter, which is how we organize all of these notes and we figure out where the emphasis is. And the emphasis often is going to be a really great cue as to what's going on in the music and what the meter is. Again, you don't necessarily have to 100% know what the meter is to be in sync with it. And so that's why I want to talk about there's a physical, there's a visual, and then there's a really mental conceptual element of this. And you just get better and better at sort of dividing up time in your brain and with your feeling and sensation as you go. Of course, our consciousness and our nerves can really make this change a lot. And so it gets me to this next concept, which is tempo. So different from meter. Tempo is how fast or slow do we do all of those relationships together. So I could do, for example, my quarter notes could be like 1 2 3 4 1 2, or they could be like 1 2 3 4. Right? It's a slower tempo, but the same relationship. This is where it can really throw people off, because if we start to lose sense of our tempo, we can lose sense of our relationships, right? If we lose sense of our relationships, we lose sense of our tempo. So these two parameters actually have to work together. A cool just thing to know for anyone who uses Google, or I'm sure there's more of these. You can get a metronome, but just a really easy tool is if you just type in metronome onto your search browser, you're going to get a little metronome thing with a sliding bar. And this is going to help you start learning about BPM and tempo. And you can actually just play around with different tempos. So I'm going to show you what I mean. So this will just help you sort of orient yourself. I think practicing with a metronome can be very, very helpful, especially if you're recording. You need everything to line up. Ultimately, it can be very robotic, and we can lose some of these other things. So that's why I didn't start with this. I know when a lot of people think about rhythm, they're like, oh, you need to use a metronome or one of those fancy watches that like vibrates on your hand at certain pulses and things like that to keep your body in sync. Um, I think it's something that's good to practice with and to keep yourself in check sometimes. But ultimately, we need this to be our own internal sense and relationship because we can't have that necessarily always there as we're performing. It can also sort of be distracting, especially if it doesn't show you the changes in emphasis that are can be really a natural experience as you're really getting into the groove or the flow of a song. But just wanted to show this that you can use this as this is at 60 BPM. What does that really mean? BPM is beats per minute. So it's that there are 60 of these, and it's literally, the reason I picked 60 is it's like you're beating one time every second. So if I did 120 BPM like this, oops, here we go. That's 2 of these clicks per second. So you can see that we're actually, as musicians, that we are learning how to divide up actual time like 2 o'clock, essentially. I mean, it doesn't have to be exactly on the clock in terms of like the atomic sense of it. But once we start, everything is in relationship to everything else. That framework helps us stay in time. And so we learn to internalize these things. You know, a song will often tell you a meter and a tempo. And you can find that. And then you can actually get a sense, okay, so it's telling me there are 4 beats in a measure if you're looking at sheet music, and it's got a tempo of, you know, whatever it is, let's say like 80. That means I'm going to do this first before I even start singing the song. I'm going to go 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Let's say it's a swung thing and it's on the offbeats. The offbeats being 2 and 4, it'll be 2, 4, 2, 4. So you can see, just like with what I do with scale work, you can start to take out certain numbers and not actually say them, but keep track of them in your mind. That's going to be when you get to the more mental or conceptual way of internalizing rhythm, and that's what makes you really, really good with staying in time and following along with other instruments. Again, there's a reality to the nature of things, which is that it's not always going to be laser sharp exactly in time. But the more that we can perceive these things, the more likely we're going to be able to actually be consistent with people and work with each other. So you might be able to sense in your mind's ear, oh, the piano player is starting to get a little slower with their tempo, or oh, they messed up a note value, but I can keep that thing going on in my head so that doesn't completely derail me. You know, you could stop if you mess up a note value, you could stop for a second and then get right back on that click track or right back on the train because you have that framework underneath it that's keeping you connected. So if you've done any music, you intuitively you really do intuitively feel this with songs. Oh, it locks with this certain chord at this moment, or I can feel that, you know, it's everything's landing here and then this chord changes here. And this leads me to my next concept, which is sometimes the best thing you can do to stay in time is actually to listen to the harmonic structure and when chords are changing. This gets harder, right? So again, different tools for different things in different situations. And it's a tool belt, and that's going to really help you hone in on what's going on. Because music, you know, to be frank, like there's so many different things out there. It can be really a nightmare to try and explain this sometimes, but this is why I'm trying to make it more like a framework in which to interpret things. The easier, more common things are going to fit within that framework, and you're going to immediately get them. But that's going to be the concept here. I'm not quite sure what you mean by put in the notes, but well, I'm going to show you with some actual chords so that you hopefully, if that's, I think that's maybe what you mean, so you can understand what I'm talking about here. So this is like what I would call like a very simple kind of contemporary song that's pulsing or is literally putting the beat on the pulse. And I'm going to do it in 4/4, and I'm going to give it like 4 chords so you can hear what I'm talking about. So let's say I'm going like this. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. So this is the pulse. You can see I started adding some little extra beats in here, But the framework of this is 4/4, and you notice I'm changing chords at each measure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, right? Now let's say I wanted to take that same chord progression, but I'm like, oh, I want it to be in a 3/4 time. This is for all my people who are writing songs and composing, and you want to get a different feeling. I could do the same thing, but instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, changing my chord right there, I'm going to change it every three. It'll be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. You see, it kind of changed a little bit of the lilt. You could see even in my body, I started sort of swaying in a different way. And that's very common when we start doing things in groups of three. We start to get this feeling of like, 1, 2, 3, da, 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 1, 2, 3, 1. So now what I'm going to show here, okay, let's say I wanted to do the 2/4 1. These are very simple songs. Chords don't always land exactly on the downbeat. Sometimes we might, let me show the 2/4 thing. It's very simple, but it'd be like 1, 2. Now, the thing about 2/4 and 4/4 is that basically are kind of the same thing, right? So again, this is all relative. It's just showing you, a sort of a structure. That's why most things are considered more like 4/4 than 2/4. Because let's say I have a song where I'm changing chords not on the downbeat all the time. Like it's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You see what I'm saying? So these things can start to change and it can get more complicated. But that can be one parameter, especially with your basic songs, that you can start to perceive it. Now, I'm going to make it more complicated and add other note values, but I'm going to keep the pulse. We're going to go back to that standard common time 4/4 thing. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, let's say I'm going to add a slightly different accompaniment, but I'm going to keep that pulse just to really show you that the pulse can be hidden in music, even though you're doing lots of other things. So what if I'm going like, right, I'm doing this little extra thing. Right? Da, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? I'm adding in that little extra accompaniment. Now let's say I'm taking away that pulse to make it a little less obvious. I'm just going. Right? So I'm sort of. So when you start taking away that obvious pulse, it starts to be harder and harder to perceive, and we have to do it a little more conceptually. That's a really, really simplified version of things. Again, the deeper you go, the deeper you go. This can get really complicated, just like anything. But I'm really just trying to work on you exploring and understanding a framework, and that's going to help you start to get a sense of, oh, now I'm in time with things, and I can hear that particular word and that note that I sing lines up with that chord right here. And there's a pulse of it all wanting to emphasize right here. These things can take a little bit of time, but it's ultimately actually kind of a natural phenomenon. Now, when we have sheet music, can just tell us exactly what it wants. Although I'd put it with a caveat that a lot of contemporary music, when you look at an arrangement that someone made of it, it's sort of like a roadmap, but it might lose a lot of the feeling if you're trying to do it very rigidly and metronomically, because there's a lot of flexibility actually in rhythm. We can do something exactly on the click track, and that might sound really perfect for something like a dancey kind of music situation. But certain things where there's like a little more wiggle room, we call it rubato in this flow, right? Time might slow down for a second and then speed up with certain chords and with the flow of the music. And that's something that you just have to start gaining experience with the more music that you do. And that, I don't want to go too far into it because it can get kind of complex, but ultimately it really is a feeling thing about being present. just like with harmony, we have this thing I would talk about, like tonal gravity, right? Where some pitches feel like, or chords feel like they're being sucked towards something, right? That they need to resolve or they're dissonant. It's the same thing with rhythm. There's things that feel like they land on the beat and things that feel like they are off of the beat. And that creates this gravity, this sort of momentum and relationships of notes that we can play off of. So that's really the main concept here. I see, I noticed you've been asking some questions about trying to sort of ground this again. Like I wish I could show you visually, like, maybe in the future I'll sort of like write them down and show them up for you. But ultimately, you can look all of this stuff up online. You can look up note values. You can look up meter, that metronome thing, and you can use these parameters to start exploring. Um, yes. So yes, this is this concept, right? Where yeah, okay, so what were the exercises, right? Let's go over this. Again, it's really just about doing this with repetition and exploring. So we had the first thing, which is finding words that fit certain note values. And you can look these up and practice just saying them. And that can be really, really helpful. The other one that we did, right, is thinking about any exercise that we do and putting it to those note values. So you can do this yourself with snaps, or you can use the metronome, but essentially you're going to go like, like our simple exercise, like ma ma ma. First I'll do it on a beat like this, ma ma ma. Let's say I want to hold that one for 4 beats and practice that. Then I might go ma ma ma, practice it like that. Or maybe it's ma ma ma, trying to get them to be half that distance. So it's a way you can take already exercises that you already have, and you just start practicing them with different note values. Really, the classic one that we do all the time, right, is doing this, where we go quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, all the way up and down. Keep this pulse, and then ma ma, eighth note, eighth note, eighth, and then ma ma ma, and you can go back and forth with that. That's what I'd recommend. Ultimately, is going to be a really, really great way to kind of get your ducks in a row. And then the other concept is to play around with tempo. So that's taking this metronome thing that I talked about, and you can try it in different places and practice getting into the pulse. So I'm going to do it at, let's do it at 100 BPM. So this means that there's 100 snaps evenly divided in 1 minute. That's what this really means. So I get this in my mind, and I try to do half. Ta 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 ta. Tucka ticky, tucka ticky, tucka ticky, tucka ticky. I'm practicing dividing them up and staying in time. It might seem easy. Again, I'm making it look easy, but it's ta 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 ta. Something you might notice that as you're doing it, I'm like ta ta ta. You're starting to get off of that click. You can start to do this with the music that you actually know and that you're playing, and you'll notice that it's very easy to get fast and slow. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it is. Let's say, for example, people are always saying, "Oh, you're rushing." That means you want to go back and you want to start to notice that this is happening. Yeah, and then the other side of it is being too slow, right? And that you're going to want to listen to the metronome and try to see if you can keep that in sync. And that's honestly like the most important and kind of like deepest understanding of this, is it's kind of a physical thing. That's why I'm getting you to move your hands. Yeah, and then so I see you got a solo. Okay, so some of these questions, I would say go check out some of our like performance preparation content. There's some on the website. Those are going to be great things. How you're preparing, it really depends on exactly what you're doing. But for example, some songs require some rhythmic analysis. And here's another sort of thing that you can practice that I recommend. So when you're doing this, like a strategy, when you're practicing something and you're trying to make sure that it really all lands in the right rhythm, the first thing that I would do is go through and figure out the beat pattern and practice snapping or tapping along with it. Um, if you have a track, you can actually just do that with the track, which can be really helpful. Then as a singer, I would say speak your words in time. This is why I'm talking about it in this system, which is it's especially as singers, it's really based off of our words and our emphasis. And a lot of rhythms are created with that in mind. As we're trying to fit lyrics into melodies, uh, it has a lot to do with how we say the right emphasis, right? If I say the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable, it starts to sound like a weird thing, right? Emphasis on the right syllable, right? And there's certain ways. Sometimes when we sing contemporary music, we kind of mix around with it, and you can note that. But again, this is sort of where I'm talking about like the primitive sense of how things come into place and how you can reverse engineer that. You find the click and the beat pattern, and then you talk on top of it, tater tots, chicken nuggets, whatever it is, and you do that without singing, and you're layering this in, and then you go in and you try to sing on top of it, because again, if we don't know the timing of things, it messes with when we take breaths. um, yeah, yeah, it's one of my favorite things actually is a lesson with the vowel sound stuff, and we'll get to that. This is one is particularly for rhythm, and it's especially for people who are working with other instrumentalists who sing and play at the same time. It can really be hard to coordinate the rhythm of your voice. And again, I just wanted to stress that some of it is a physical thing. Our voice can be kind of sluggish. So, one other thing that I could say as an exercise is to do something that I've been talking about in the last few lessons, which is staccato practice. It just helps you get your body up to speed. Because if you're someone who takes lessons from me, something that I point out that if you're not used to this physically, it takes a while for your body to get the right pressure for certain notes. And sometimes in the pursuit of trying to get the right pitch and everything, we tend to sing slow. Most people tend to sing slow unless they're really nervous. Then we tend to jump the gun sometimes because we get disoriented. But generally, when we're singing in the right thing, we tend to get behind the beat just because we're trying to get our mechanism working. So this is why I do all these practices, right? Like I'll do some breath pulsing. It's remarkably hard. I'm going to go slow and then faster. And you could do this to the rhythm. You could go like, start to see why I do all of these things. They're all connected, right? And this is thinking about my lower belly, right? If this is new to you, it's something that we talk about with breath pressure and support. Any of those classes, we breathe low through our belly and our back. We let that expand, and then you push out, and it creates this resistance of air. Now I can go like this, and then I could double it. So that was like quarter notes, and then I did a long one, like perhaps like a whole note. Then I might do. And that's actually kind of takes some time. Try to go even a little faster, like, doing the 4 notes per beat. That would be like. That takes a lot of work, right? It's actually a lot of energy. So again, you could do that with just breath. Then you could start doing this kind of thing. You could be like, ha 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 ha. We're doing staccato, and it's just to wake up our body. Yes, I do teach lessons through the website. I teach privately. A number of things. And I also guitar and piano and theory and songwriting skills. And it just depends on what you particularly want. Most of the time, it's a lot of vocal technique stuff about how we grow and build our voice. This one is getting your voice out of sort of a sluggish mode is what I'm talking about now, because that tends to be the case. So I might do this, right? A similar pattern of like, ha, 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 but they're short and detached. Because when we, sometimes it can get a little too slow, right? And we lose the sense of our beat pattern. So I might go like, ha, 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 ha. Oh, and that's hard, right? Like, ha, 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 ha. So that's actually talking about vocal agility. I have a whole class on agility as well, but that'll help you ultimately as well, staying in time in terms of like a physical sense of things. It's just being able to to be able to actually jump around fast enough so that you get the right sound at the right time, because there's a little bit of a delay when we're thinking about setting up our instrument. We have to think about our breath first, generate the current, and then we can start to sing on things. And sometimes if we're not ready to set up, we're going to start to be behind. That's often what happens, right? This is what I was talking about with this conductor thing. This is a classic 4/4 beat pattern. And then the hand comes up and then down for when, that's the classic sort of starting on the downbeat. And a lot of people, what happens is they go like this. They like, right? And then you're like, "Ooh," up here, right? Rather than the secret pro tip, which is to watch the beat pattern, plan ahead. And you're going to be starting right on time. Um, Again, if you're really getting slow with something, think about doing staccato and doing shorter pulses first. There's this general thing, and now I'm just talking about like some little practical tips and tools. There's this general thing when we start to do bigger motions, it slows us down. So this is true for conductors as well. If you're a conductor, when you're doing this a lot, it's visually, it just slows people. Actually, the best thing for fast tempos is to get smaller and lighter. And that's a sort of a truth I talk about with agility. I'll keep that in mind about Laura and singing vowels like that. That's actually a current sort of a track that we're going to be going down more in the future. And I just made some content about how to sing like Ed Sheeran and like Abel from The Weeknd, and like particularly some sort of breakdown things. So we'll talk about that. I can't really sing their music, but we can talk about sort of the stylistic elements that compose the sound, and we can emulate it, right? Rather than completely 100% imitate. Although it's kind of easy if you're imitating things, sometimes it's actually the easiest and most impressive thing to show, but ultimately there's already that person out there. And so you want to find your own unique sound by emulating. And that's a really great strategy. We'll get to more of that in the future. But again, I just want to go to this concept of sometimes when we over physicalize things, it can slow us down just because there's a limitation to our body. So that's why ultimately, as you start to do this more and more, and you get a good sense of momentum with your body, you can start to conceptualize it. That's using your voice, doing the like ta ta ti 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 taka tiki taka tiki ta 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 ta, that kind of thing that you'll hear all the time. Like that sort of practice can be very helpful. Eventually, even it just becomes something in your mind, and you want to practice just sort of counting and keeping track of this. Um, you know, that's a thing that I offer for students in terms of sending videos, just because I get a lot of content. But that's certainly something that we do and we talk about as people make content, and I give feedback and we talk about sort of development from there. Sometimes it's a rhythmic thing. Sometimes it's a pitch thing, right? Sometimes it's a technical thing, and these are all just different parameters that we use to improve our music. Oh, I see, rhythm and pitch. Yeah, do you mean like the two connected, as in like rhythm and pitch, like because it's going too fast or too slow, or if it's again, it's just with a lot of these specific things for a solo, I would really need to like look at the actual particular thing. I see, I see. And is it because it's too fast or too slow? That's the other question that I would start to ask, as I'm talking about when someone's struggling with pitching something in time. If it's fast, then you're gonna want to do some of that staccato practice. So like, ha 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 ha. You realize your body might miss it a few times if you're doing multiple hits. That's totally normal. Like ha 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 ha, and you're calibrating ha 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 ha, and teaching your body to really get the right amount of pressure. It does this sort of almost like a supercomputer. So we just have to give it some time to practice that. So that might be one thing. Sometimes if it's too slow, we tend to fall flat a lot of the time because we're just starting to press on it, and that has to do with sustains. And so what I'd recommend to you is play around with the tempo a little bit. If you've got some flexibility and you're not just doing it to a track and you have an accompanist, you might actually ask them, like, can we try this a little faster or a little slower here? And that might help you actually set up and do it appropriately. Just note that if you go too slow, you start running out of breath and you can't make it through your phrases. You go too fast and it's just too hard to set up sometimes. Um, yeah. Oh, I know what you're talking about. The Moana song. Yeah. Again, I wish I could sing it directly with you. I know that one. I have the sheet music for it because it's a common fun song that people want to do. That one's a fast one. I know exactly what you're talking about. Um, oh, I wish I could go over that specifically with you. But again, I think that falls more into the purview of like actually working one on one with someone, because I could give you some specific tools and tips for that. What I will say is when you're doing things with lots of words like that, I call it sort of like pitter patter, you want to make sure that you carve some time for yourself to breathe. And I'll leave with this one too. Sometimes, I was talking about that breath setup thing being a challenge. You can actually work on filling up with air. Be careful with this kind of exercise because it can make you kind of lightheaded, so you don't overdo it. But you can actually practice your ability to tank up with air rather quickly, because sometimes we don't get that much time to breathe. And so what I do is I blow out all my air and I squish it out. And this is sort of what we normally don't want to do when we're singing, but it's so that I can feel physical release. So when we're worried about trying to get from one breath to the next and there's not a lot of time, we tend to do that thing I was talking about where we come off our body and we start gulping or gasping for air. And it's a really bad habit, actually. And it will end up actually locking things in place and make you more sluggish and then more tight. So the trick is actually these slower, more relaxed breaths if you can do them. And they have to be just lower in general. So I do this to actually physically train my body. I go like, squishing out all my air, and then let my belly expand and let it go. So it's through that resistance, you're feeling completely empty, your body will spring open, and that can actually teach you to do that more. So let's say you're singing, 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 you're running out of breath, and then you can let this just drop, right? Like that feeling, right? Again, don't practice this too much. It can really make you lightheaded, but doing a little bit of that, incorporating into your exercises, can be really helpful. And then I'll just leave you with this one more concept, because it's very practical and I think very much in theme with what we're talking about here. Thinking about the ends, letting go of certain phrases. So, sometimes we think we want to hold on to them to the very end and then start singing the next thing. If you just give yourself a little more time to breathe there, it's going to help a lot. And there's certain, I will mark these into my scores sometimes. Like I use like a little comma or a little apostrophe with a circle, and it's just a visual cue, like take a breath there. I'll put in rests if you know sheet music stuff. And then the other thing I'd say for visual people, and again, I need to think about how I could sort of help people do this on this format. But talking about sheet music, because normally I do like screen share and that kind of a thing, but I will literally write in the beats. I'll go like 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll group them. And it's a very visual thing on sheet music so that we can process this that way. And then I can actually start to see the groupings of beats, and that also helps me stay in alignment. But don't be afraid to take a little bit of shave a little bit of time off of the end of something and do like a little staccato ending so that you can take a breath and restart. Good. Yeah, I think I know exactly what you're talking, especially since you told me exactly the song that you're working on. Because again, different strategies are needed for different things that we're doing. When they fall on like the slower or the faster end of the spectrum, certain things happen to our voice. And yeah, that's sort of the game, right? So some of that would be also doing some exercises where we're working on just sort of moving throughout the range rather quickly. And in general, when I'm doing my exercises, this is just also really important to note. I often will start slow, right? If you do know any of my sort of like beginner warm up stuff and vowel work things, I start really slow and I work on muscle isolation so that the right muscles are working and the other ones aren't blocking it. That increases our speed. So it's funny, right? Slow down and sort of break things apart a little bit. That really helps. And then as I'm doing my conditioning, I start to speed up over time, actually. And it's actually just a great way to practice seeing if the coordination can get faster and faster, because we're an athlete of small muscles and it's about coordination. So you have to warm yourself up with it. You can't just force yourself to go fast, because a lot of times, again, we're going to come off of our body and then we're going to start straining. And then you're doing all this work with your mouth, singing through different words, and then you just twist it up in a knot. So in general, there's a range that's comfortable for vocalists to sing too slow and it's a problem, and too fast and it's a problem. So that's just something that comes with practice. Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like a really good plan. I'll be excited to meet you and talk more about all of that, especially musical theater and Disney like things. Like it can be a challenge sometimes to get on those really fast tempos. So I think I'll just make sure I've got anything else that I've lost. Oh, one last tip, and I know I'm sorry I've gone a little over today, but just lots of questions, which I really really love. And again, I can't always answer everything in every topic, but if you're asking things, it goes into my brain somewhere, and then I'll think about new topics and ways to sort of break down the material. Can't talk about everything at once because it just is too much material, and that's part of this practice and being a teacher is breaking it down into digestible bits. My last thing is rhythm is visual, and not just in terms of sheet music. Watch people, right? Watch your fellow artists. If you're working with other instruments, the best thing you can do is get out of your music, get out of your own tunnel vision, like nerves and anxiety, and be present with people. Because when in doubt, when things are falling out of rhythm, use other humans and you can catch each other again and build that up. It happens all the time. That's the whole point of having a conductor, because you have multiple instrumentalists who all have their own consciousness and perception of time, and you need something that anchors everybody together. And that's the mime who's up there in front showing much more than just beat patterns, but timbre and energy and emotion. But they're doing this and they're keeping you on a pulse. And it's visual. So watching them is going to be the best thing that you can do. It's like archery. You'll look at the right target, you tend to land there. You tend to do it at the right time. So when in doubt, watch each other, breathe with each other. These are ways that we stay in time and just in a more realistic sense, right? There's nothing worse than an accompanist perhaps, who's playing and they're like, I'm set on a tempo and I practice with the metronome and I'm not going to listen to anyone, because they're going to get off eventually. That's unless people are following them exactly to point, and even then they're probably just going to get off because sometimes we have to swallow or little things happen and our breath change and variation. So again, one of the biggest things you can do is just watch, use your eyes, and that's going to help you a ton, especially if you have a conductor as your guide. So it's their job to keep you in time, and ultimately, like it's yeah, it's a team effort, of course, but like they're going to be there to kind of help you if you fall out of sync, right? Because it's just hard thing to do when you have a lot of people all trying to do something at the same time. So there you go. Hopefully that was helpful. Again, I'm just giving some little tidbits and introduction into rhythm. There's so much to talk about, but hopefully that got you some concepts of note values, simple meters, tempo, application a little bit into like actual song work, and some technical approaches to help us do that better. So it's a lot to cover in an hour. Looking forward to meeting all of you who want to take lessons. And again, hopefully that was really helpful. Keep letting us know what you want to work on. And again, Camila and I are alternating every few weeks with different topics. So if you get that info out, this is something that I really want to do. It gives me or her some time to sort of plan a strategy to help you get there. So anyways, have a good rest of the day, and I will catch you all next time, which is going to be in a few weeks. All right, take care.